Hi listeners, welcome to another Footnote episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
I am Chris Holiday.
And Stacey Abbott has stayed behind after the paranormal episode last week to do a quick footnote on horror cinema. So this is going to be quite the challenge, but you're going to have to tell us all about what it is, all its history, everything in 10 minutes. That's the rules. So we best get cracking.
And it
Stacey.
is, if we've timed this right, this is Halloween, so this is on.
Yes. What better day to pick up a lovely academic book and start your intellectual journey in horror rather than just watch some fun movies. So Stacey, the first, I guess, big question is, what is horror cinema? Can you provide us with a definition to get us going?
Yes, I think my starting definition is saying that it's a type of cinema that is designed to generate a particular emotional effect in its audience, to generate feelings of fear, anxiety, shock, disgust, revulsion, or any of the above. Unease. It's designed to provoke emotions in its audience, and that is its fundamental purpose and its fundamental effect. And it does that in a range of different ways.
Okay, easy. Good start. Okay, so I guess, where is its origins? Is this something, I guess, that's been around since sort of stories were told, or maybe what's its cinematic origins would be an easier place to go to?
Yeah, cinematic origins are, I would argue that it's there from the very earliest days of cinema, that we start seeing in even the pioneer days of short trick films, them playing with, images of monsters, demons, designed to, if not generate a scare, to generate a spectacle and engagement, confront horror, confront audiences with things that are unsettling or disturbing or provocative images. And then as early cinema moves into lengthier storytelling, very quickly filmmakers turn to Gothic literature.
Okay.
So we start seeing in 1910, Edison's company makes Frankenstein, and then we start seeing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and all of these and of course at that point no one was calling them necessarily horror films, but they are playing with Gothic tropes. They are definitely designed to unsettle and disturb. And this just progresses through the kind of silent era. So we have loads of films from Germany, Expressionism, Nosferatu. There's just this fascination with the supernatural and the occult and these kind of unsettling emotions. And then all of that gets sort of settled into a more defined genre in the 1930s with the coming of sound, which I think is a really important element to horror becoming a more recognizable genre, that sound becomes really key. And we get Universal Studios and then other American studios start making these kind of iconic horror films. And from Dracula, Frankenstein, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, Mad Love. And these films start becoming marketed and presented as horror films because they are recognized to generate a horrific effect in their audiences. And it kind of takes from there. So it kind of has this kind of slow birth over the first 20, 30 years of cinema till it becomes quite fully formed as a recognizable genre, which of course then continues to evolve and change as audiences change. Because if it's a genre based on a need to create an emotional effect of unease and fear and anxiety, well, what affects us is going to be different from generation to generation. We're just not going to be scared of the same things or have the same anxieties that the genre is playing off of.
It sounds like a genre that it's one of the harder ones to define, because its key defining implement is a response rather than a thing in the text. It's not film noir, is it? So is there anything we should be looking for in terms of codes and conventions, or should we root it really just in that kind of things that scare us? Because that obviously takes us from Frankenstein to Psycho to anything in between,
thinking
right?
Like body genres and things like that. It feels like it's more rooted in, as you say, that
it's rooted in very physical. It's a genre that's designed to have almost physical effect on its audience, and I think we respond to physicality. So the body is definitely a key thing that links all of these tropes together, whether it's vampires and zombies or slashers. It's built around our anxieties around the body, either the body as threat or the body as threatened. And I think one of the key tropes or themes that that bind a lot of them together is fear of the other, fear of difference. And something kind of, a threat that is othered, or a challenge to that perception of the other being a threat. You know, that inversion of taking something that historically was considered to be quote unquote normal and revealing that to be monstrous. So our relationship to the other is a kind of key thing that horror negotiates, and as a very recurring trope. But you're right, it's because it's designed to have an emotional effect. What you get with horror are a series of subgenres. And the subgenres are the ones where you have much more codified, recognizable traditions. So, you know, vampire films, which is one of my preferred hobby horses, is, you know, it's filled with kind of codes and iconography and conventions, from religious imagery to garlic and wooden stakes and coffins, or even when it abandons that, in more recent ones we have sunlight and we have silver, and you know, it is just filled with, we all know what a vampire looks like. We know, you know, we've been taught what to expect. But likewise with slasher films, with possession films, The Exorcist is recurring, is celebrating its 50th anniversary.
These are all subgenres.
These are
rather
subgenres.
Than anything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's arguably overlap between them. If you watch The Exorcist 3, one could just say that that's a possession film, but it's also a slasher film.
Okay.
You know, I think there's definitely dialogue, but I think subgenres are a useful way to think about them if you're looking to kind of how to recognize them. But I think as audiences, we kind of know a horror film when we see one.
Yeah.
You
Sounds
know?
very much like fantasy to me.
Yeah.
So,
the classic. That's the film I point to is the thing that.
Yeah.
I had a question which I guess is more sort of industrial, because you said that there seem to be these interesting phases of horror, and I quite like the idea that sound comes along and does something to the, given what we know about fantasy and special effects, and presumably horror and special effects, and. I guess I had a question about kind of it seems to me from the outside, as somebody who's not an expert at all in horror, and as I said to you about an hour ago, I only saw Carrie for the first time last night. Why, maybe there is no answer, why are horror films so conducive to sort of series like sequels and franchises? Because that seems quite a recurring feature of the genre. So it is rooted in kind of affect and spectatorial response, but it's also, I just feel like a lot of horror films are franchised and made into serials. I just wondered if you had any kind of thought.
do. I mean, I think beyond the commercial success, which is an obvious answer, I think it's because there's something about the monster or the threat that is something that even when a film ends and you've contained it, or we've stopped and we've destroyed it, we know the monster will always come back. And I think there's that, and that's been the case since, you know, the 30s at Universal, where yes, we kill the vampire, but we'll have another vampire film. It'll be his daughter, or it'll be the son of Dracula, or the Wolfman, and the mummy films, endless mummy films, because there's a recognition that actually you may stop them, but they will come back, and that somehow you can never fully. And I think that's one of the pleasures, and one of the things that's interesting about horror, even when it seems to be contained, it's not really. They will continue in that kind of Robin Wood, Return of the Repressed. The monster will continue to erupt into society and disrupt our cozy world.
I ask one question about kind of reception. I guess there are two ways you can be interested in horror. There's the way that I'm interested in horror, which is watching it and being interested in what it does and enjoying it and things like that. And then there's the way my partner's interested in horror, which is just to say, why on earth would anyone be interested in horror, right? And the way that articulates that kind of, there seems to be quite it's quite a genre that's always fighting for its sort of, for it's not only just its legitimacy, but it's almost like it's respect. It's not just about artistic respectability; it's about kind of moral respectability, right? So I wonder if you could sort of talk about that and how that might have played out over its history.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a genre that has a history of being, and is often described as being inherently disreputable. Because it invites us to wallow in these negative emotions, and yet it's also been historically very popular. And I think that it divides audiences, or that reception, from people who do not recognize the benefits or the pleasures in wallowing in those negative emotions, and see it as, and understandably in some cases, see it as exploitative. and see it as celebrating violence without recognizing that often from the perspective of horror audiences that there is a process going through the watching of confronting these things, or often that seeming exploitation of violence is actually channeling violence or exploring kind of ideas about violence. That just showing violence doesn't necessarily mean it's just celebrating it. It can be often critiquing it or highlighting the issues of violence or showing kind of the dangers and damage of violence. So there's all kinds of complexity to that reception.
Yeah.
But I think it and I think you're right, going back to the question, is that there is often there's two divided responses from fans, which is some to say, we don't have to defend our pleasure in horror. It is what it is, and it's fine. And then often that need to explain it and say, but no, actually it's doing. And I'm going to use that much hated word by many horror fans, which is elevated horror.
Oh, yeah.
To justify horror by saying it's elevated and saying, well, actually, no, all horror has certain potential benefits. And we may have a period of certain films that have come out in recent years that are quite intellectual and that are using horror as allegory or more suggestive. But that has always been a part of horror, and horror can be as intellectual or interesting or thought-provoking in its most basest of body horror elements. So I think, that notion of elevated horror is often used to kind of try to justify particularly for people who maybe are uncomfortable with horror.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what I was going to say, so what are the key, we've sort of, it is a format point rather than a desire to stop you speaking, but are there, I don't know, kind of couple of key texts beyond your own writing that you feel like would be really a useful starting point for students maybe to think about horror and some of the things that you've spoken about?
I would, I think one of the key texts for me that I come back to a lot is Robin Wood's Introduction to the American Horror Film, I think it's called, and it's been republished in a number of places, so you can find it in a number of places. Okay. And I think it's a really useful way of thinking about the functions of horror and the pleasures of horror. I would also argue that Barbara Creed's Monstrous Feminine is a fantastic piece of work about the female monster, which is a really recurring trope across the genre, both positively and negatively. And Bridget Cherry's Routledge Companion to Horror is a fantastic introduction to critical thinking about horror. And I think if anyone's looking for something to just begin to start thinking about those questions about what is horror, why is this useful, I think it's a really helpful starting point.
There's our bibliography.
There we are, done. Stacey, thank you so much. How you did that in 10 minutes, I don't know, but it was a pleasure to watch you do it. So thank you so much for coming back on the show. If you have suggestions for future Footnote episodes, you can email us at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com, and we'll be delighted to take them for future episodes. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Bye. Oh, and happy Halloween.